In the frozen silence of dawn, where breath turns to ice, and every step could mean death, she pressed her eye to the scope and whispered a promise to the wind. The enemy below had no idea that their fate rested in the steady hands of a woman they would never see coming. This is not a story of war as men tell it, filled with charging armies and thundering guns. This is the story of Elena Vasquez, a shepherd's daughter who became the most feared sniper the mountains had ever known, and how she turned the tide of an impossible war, with nothing but patience, precision, and a promise she made to her dying father. What you're about to read happened in the remote peaks of a country torn apart by conflict, where survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant protecting everyone you loved, even if it cost you everything you were. Elena Vasquez had always known the mountains better than most people knew their own homes. At 23, she could read the weather in the way shadows fell across granite faces, predict avalanches by the sound the wind made through certain passes, and track a lost goat across terrain that would challenge experienced climbers. Her father Miguel used to say she had mountain blood, that the peaks had claimed her heart before she could even walk. The village of San Rafael clung to the mountainside like a desperate prayer, its stone houses built into the natural curves of the rock face. 300 souls lived there, most of them shepherds and farmers who had never traveled more than 50 miles from where they were born. Elena was different. She had studied at the regional university, earned a degree in environmental science, and planned to return to help her community adapt to the changing climate that threatened their ancient way of life. But war had other plans. The conflict that tore through their country came like a summer storm, sudden and devastating. Political tensions that had simmered for decades finally boiled over when the government fell to a military coup. The new regime promised order and prosperity, but what they delivered was oppression and violence. Entire regions that dared to resist found themselves under siege, cut off from supplies and communication. San Rafael should have been too remote to matter. Tucked away in the highest peaks of the Cordillera, accessible only by a single winding road that took 4 hours to navigate even in perfect weather, the village seemed invisible to the outside world. Elena's father often joked that they were so high up, even God had to use binoculars to see them. The joke stopped being funny when the first military convoy arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October. Elena was checking her father's sheep in the high pasture when she heard the engines. The sound carried strangely in the thin air, echoing off canyon walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. She dropped the medical supplies she had been using to treat an injured ewe and scrambled up a rocky outcrop that gave her a clear view of the valley road. 3 military trucks wound their way up the mountain like metal serpents, their camouflaged bodies stark against the autumn landscape. Elena had never seen military vehicles this close to home, and something cold settled in her stomach as she watched them approach. The government forces had been pushing into the mountain regions for months, establishing control over strategic routes and resource-rich areas. She ran down the mountain faster than she had ever moved in her life, her boots sliding on loose scree as she raced to warn the village. Her father was in the square discussing repairs to the old church with Father Martinez and several other men, when she burst into their circle gasping and wild-eyed. "Military trucks," she panted, pointing toward the valley road. 3 of them, maybe 15 minutes out. The conversation stopped. Father Martinez crossed himself. Miguel Vasquez looked at his daughter with the expression of a man watching his world collapse. "How many soldiers?" asked Carlos Mendez, the village leader. "I couldn't count exactly, but each truck looked full." The men exchanged glances that carried the weight of unspoken fears. They all knew what had happened in other mountain villages. Sometimes the soldiers came looking for rebels or deserters. Sometimes they came for resources, food, or young men to press into service. Sometimes they came for reasons no one ever understood, and those were the visits that left villages burning. "We need to hide anything valuable," Miguel said quietly. "And we need to think about who might need to disappear for a while." Elena knew what he meant. Her cousin Roberto had deserted from the army 6 months earlier and made his way home through 200 miles of hostile territory. Her friend Maria had been secretly distributing pamphlets critical of the regime. Elena herself had been involved in organizing protests at the university before coming home. The next hour passed in a blur of desperate preparation. Families hid their best livestock in caves known only to local shepherds. Weapons, mostly hunting rifles and old shotguns, disappeared into caches hidden in the mountains. Roberto and 2 other men slipped away into the forest with packs full of supplies. Elena helped her father move their most valuable sheep to a hidden meadow accessible only by a path that looked like nothing more than a goat track. As they worked, Miguel kept glancing at his daughter with an expression she couldn't read. "You should go with Roberto," he said finally as they secured the last gate. "What? No. This is my home too. Elena, You're educated. You've been to the university. You organized those protests. Miguel's voice was heavy with worry. These soldiers, they have lists. Names of people who might cause trouble. She wanted to argue, but the sound of truck engines was growing louder. They were out of time. The convoy rolled into San Rafael, just as the church bell was ringing 3 o'clock. The trucks disgorged 30 soldiers in full combat gear, their weapons at the ready as if they expected to face armed resistance from a village of shepherds and farmers. Elena watched from the window of her family's house as the soldiers spread out through the square. Their commander, a thin man with the insignia of a major, spoke briefly with Father Martinez before gesturing for his men to begin searching the buildings. The search was thorough and violent. Soldiers kicked in doors, overturned furniture, and demanded to know the whereabouts of deserters and rebels. They found nothing incriminating, but they took food, blankets, and several of the village's best animals. Worse, they took 3 young men, claiming they were needed for military service. Elena's heart nearly stopped when she saw her youngest brother, Diego, pushed roughly into the back of one of the trucks. He was only 17, barely more than a boy, and the terror in his eyes was visible even from her hiding place. Miguel tried to intervene, stepping forward with his hat in his hands. Please, sir, the boy is needed here. Our flock. The major backhanded him across the face, sending the older man sprawling. The state needs soldiers more than you need shepherds, old man. Be grateful we don't take more. Elena had to bite her own hand to keep from crying out. She watched her father pick himself up from the dirt, blood trickling from his split lip as the trucks prepared to leave. As his convoy prepared to depart, he addressed the gathered villagers with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to absolute power. This region is now under military control, he announced. Any resistance will be met with force. Any harboring of deserters or rebels will result in severe punishment. We will return in 1 month to collect taxes and supplies for the war effort.
He paused, scanning the frightened faces before him. I suggest you use that time to consider your loyalties carefully.
The trucks disappeared down the mountain road, leaving behind a village transformed by fear.
Elena emerged from hiding to find her father sitting on their front step, staring at the spot where Diego had been taken. We have to do something, she said. Miguel looked up at her with eyes that seemed to have aged years in a single afternoon. What can we do, mija? We're shepherds. They have guns and trucks and the power of the state behind them.
There has to be something. Her father was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out an object wrapped in oiled cloth. Elena had never seen it before, but she recognized what it was as soon as he unwrapped it. A rifle scope. Old, but clearly well-maintained.
Your grandfather was a different kind of shepherd, Miguel said quietly. During the revolution, he spent 3 years in these mountains, keeping the government forces from controlling the passes. They never caught him, never even saw him. He used to say that a single rifle in the right hands in the right place could do more than 100 men charging across open ground. Elena stared at the scope, understanding beginning to dawn. I'm too old now, her father continued. My eyes aren't what they were, and my hands shake in the cold. But you, Elena, you know these mountains better than anyone. You're a better shot than most men twice your age. Jobs, and you have something your grandfather never had. What's that? A reason to be angry. That night, Elena climbed to the highest peak overlooking their valley, carrying her grandfather's old hunting rifle and the scope her father had given her. She found a position that gave her a clear view of the road while remaining invisible from below. She didn't plan to shoot anyone that first night. She just wanted to see if it was possible, if the stories her grandfather had told were more than just old man's boasting. She spent hours studying the approaches to the village, noting sightlines and distances, thinking about angles and wind patterns. As dawn approached, Elena realized that her grandfather had been right about something else. One person in the right place, with the right skills and the right motivation, could change everything. She made a promise to herself that morning, watching the sun rise over peaks that had sheltered her family for generations. The soldiers would return, just as they had promised. When they did, they would find that the mountains had claimed another protector. Elena Vasquez, the shepherd's daughter with a university degree and steady hands, was about to become something her enemies would never expect. Their worst nightmare in a landscape they couldn't understand or control. The war for San Rafael was about to begin, and it would be fought on terms the military had never encountered. In the days that followed, Elena would transform from a young woman trying to protect her family into a legend whispered about in military camps across the region. But that transformation would come at a cost she couldn't yet imagine. and would demand choices that would change her forever. The mountains that had raised her were about to test everything she thought she knew about herself, about right and wrong, and about what one person could accomplish when everything they loved was at stake. The enemy was coming back. And when they did, they would discover that the mountains had eyes, and those eyes belonged to someone who had nothing left to lose. The transformation didn't happen overnight. In the weeks following the military convoy's visit, Elena threw herself into preparation with the methodical intensity she had once applied to her environmental studies. But instead of analyzing soil samples and watershed patterns, she was now mapping kill zones and calculating bullet trajectories. Her father helped without question, though she could see the weight of worry settling on his shoulders like snow that never melts. Miguel had survived one war in these mountains as a young man, fighting alongside his father against a different enemy. He understood what his daughter was choosing, and what it would cost both of them. "Remember," he told her during one of their evening planning sessions, "your grandfather's first rule was never to become predictable. The moment they can guess where you'll be or what you'll do, you're already dead." Elena nodded, studying the hand-drawn maps spread across their kitchen table. She had spent the last 3 weeks hiking every trail, climbing every ridge, and memorizing every cave and outcrop in a 20-mile radius. Her university training in geography served her well, allowing her to see the landscape as an interconnected system of sightlines, escape routes, and strategic positions. "The second rule," Miguel continued, "is that you're not trying to win a battle. You're trying to make them afraid to come back." Word from the outside world filtered into San Rafael through the few villagers brave enough to make trips to distant towns. The news was uniformly bad. The military government was consolidating its control, and mountain regions that resisted were being systematically isolated and starved into submission. Several villages had been evacuated entirely, their populations relocated to camps where they could be more easily monitored. Elena learned that Diego and the other young men taken from San Rafael had been sent to a training facility 300 miles away. Letters, smuggled out through sympathetic relatives, painted a grim picture of forced indoctrination, brutal discipline, and boys transformed into soldiers against their will. The knowledge that her little brother was being turned into a weapon for the same regime that threatened their village added fuel to Elena's growing determination. She practiced with her rifle until she could put 3 shots through a playing card at 400 yards. She learned to move through the mountains like smoke, leaving no tracks and making no sound. Most importantly, she learned to wait. The major had promised to return in 1 month. But Elena knew military schedules were flexible things. It might be weeks, or it might be tomorrow. She established a network of observation posts throughout the valley, positions she could reach quickly and abandon even faster. Each site was carefully chosen to provide multiple escape routes and overlapping fields of fire. Roberto, who had returned secretly to the village after the soldiers left, helped her establish supply caches and communication systems. The former soldier brought valuable knowledge of military tactics and equipment, though he initially expressed doubts about Elena's plan. "You're talking about taking on an entire military unit by yourself," he said during one of their clandestine meetings in a cave high above the village. "Even if you could pick off 1 or 2 soldiers, what happens when they bring reinforcements? What happens when they decide to make an example of the whole village?" Elena had thought about this constantly. The truth was, she didn't have a complete answer. But she had studied enough military history to understand that asymmetric warfare worked on psychological principles as much as tactical ones. "They're not expecting resistance," she said. "Especially not from someone like me. Their whole strategy depends on intimidation and overwhelming force. But what happens when their forces start disappearing? When convoys don't reach their destinations? When soldiers start refusing assignments to this region because they know they might not come back?" Roberto remained skeptical, but he helped anyway. Love for his village and hatred of the regime that had forced him to flee outweighed his tactical concerns. The waiting ended on a gray Tuesday morning in late November. Elena was checking one of her observation posts when she spotted movement on the valley road. This time, it was a smaller force, just 1 truck and what appeared to be a military jeep. As they drew closer, she counted 8 soldiers plus the driver and a passenger in the jeep who wore the insignia of a lieutenant. She had time to reach any of 3 different shooting positions, but she chose the one she had designated as Eagle's Nest, a natural rock formation that provided excellent concealment and a clear view of the entire route the convoy would have to take. Elena settled into position behind her grandfather's rifle, her breathing slow and controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The scope brought the approaching vehicles into sharp focus. She could see individual faces now, soldiers who looked bored and confident, men who saw this as a routine mission to a defeated village.
The convoy reached the hairpin turn where the mountain road doubled back on itself, a spot Elena had identified as perfect for her purposes. The vehicles would have to slow down significantly, and the steep drop on one side would limit their options for evasive maneuvers. She let the jeep pass through the turn, waiting until the truck was at exactly the right angle. Elena's first shot was aimed not at a person, but at the truck's front tire. The bullet struck exactly where she intended, blowing out the tire and sending the vehicle careening toward the cliff edge before the driver managed to bring it to a skidding stop. The soldiers poured out of the disabled truck, shouting and looking around frantically for the source of the attack.
Elena's position was over 800 yards away and perfectly concealed. To the soldiers below, the shot could have come from anywhere. Her second shot took out the rear tire of the Jeep as it attempted to reverse back up the road. Now both vehicles were disabled, and the soldiers were trapped in a narrow section of road with limited cover. Elena could have killed any of them easily. They were exposed, panicked, and had no idea where the threat was coming from. Instead, she put her third shot into the ground directly between two soldiers, close enough to spray them with dirt and stone chips. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. Hardened soldiers who were accustomed to terrorizing defenseless villagers suddenly found themselves the hunted instead of the hunters. They had no target to shoot back at, no enemy to charge, no way to use their superior firepower. The lieutenant was screaming orders, trying to organize some kind of response, when Elena's fourth shot shattered the radio antenna on the Jeep. Now they couldn't call for help, couldn't report their location, couldn't do anything except huddle behind their disabled vehicles and wait for the next shot that might or might not come. Elena held her fire and watched through her scope as the soldiers struggled with a situation their training had never prepared them for. They were mountain fighters, supposedly specialists in difficult terrain, but they had been trained to fight conventional enemies, other soldiers who would reveal themselves and engage in straightforward combat. After 20 minutes of tense waiting, the lieutenant made the decision Elena had been hoping for. Rather than stay trapped on the exposed road, he ordered his men to abandon their vehicles and begin the long walk back down the mountain on foot. Elena shadowed them from the high ridges, moving parallel to their route but always staying well ahead. Twice, she put shots close enough to keep them nervous but never close enough to inflict casualties. She wanted them afraid, not angry. Dead soldiers would bring overwhelming retaliation, but soldiers who returned to base with stories of an invisible enemy who could have killed them at any time would have a different effect entirely. The 8-man patrol took 6 hours to walk back to the main road, constantly looking over their shoulders and jumping at every sound. Elena followed them almost the entire way, occasionally dropping a rock near their position or snapping a branch to remind them they were being watched. By the time they reached safety, the soldiers were exhausted, demoralized, and thoroughly spooked. Elena made her way back to San Rafael through paths only she knew, arriving home just as the evening bell was ringing. Miguel was waiting for her with the expression of profound relief and barely concealed pride. "How did it go?" "They won't be back anytime soon," Elena said, cleaning her rifle with the care her grandfather had taught her. "And when they do come back, it won't be with one truck." She was right. 3 days later, Roberto returned from a scouting trip to the main road with disturbing news. A full military company, nearly 100 soldiers, with armored vehicles and heavy weapons, was establishing a forward operating base in the valley below. They were clearly preparing for a much more serious operation. "This is what I was afraid of," Roberto said grimly. "You've gotten their attention. Now they're going to come with enough firepower to level the entire mountain if they have to." Elena had expected this escalation. In fact, she had been counting on it. "Good," she said, surprising both Roberto and her father. "Let them come with 100 soldiers. Let them bring tanks and helicopters if they want. This isn't their mountain." Over the following week, Elena put the second phase of her plan into motion. Working with volunteers from the village, she established supply lines that stretched deep into the high peaks. Caves that had sheltered shepherds during winter storms were converted into weapons caches and observation posts. Ancient trails known only to locals were mapped and prepared for rapid movement. Most importantly, Elena began training others. Maria, who had distributed underground newspapers, proved to have natural skill as a spotter and communications coordinator. 2 of the older teenagers, boys whose fathers had been taken by the military, learned to move silently through the forest and relay messages across long distances. Elena wasn't building an army.
She was creating something much more dangerous, a network of invisible watchers who could track every movement the military made while remaining completely undetectable themselves. The psychological warfare campaign intensified. Supply convoys heading to the forward operating base began experiencing mysterious problems.
Tires would go flat at precisely the most inconvenient moments. Radio antennas would be found cut in the morning. Sentries reported seeing movement in the darkness that vanished the moment they looked directly at it. No one was being killed, but the soldiers stationed at the base grew increasingly nervous.
They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't understand.
Morale plummeted as stories spread of the ghost sniper who could strike anywhere, anytime without warning. Elena's reputation grew with each incident.
Soldiers began requesting transfers out of the mountain region. Officers found it increasingly difficult to maintain discipline among troops who felt they were being watched constantly by an invisible enemy.
But Elena knew this psychological campaign could only work for so long. Eventually, the military would either withdraw from the region entirely or escalate to the kind of massive retaliation that would destroy everything she was trying to protect.
The test came on a cold morning in December, when Elena's spotters reported movement unlike anything they had seen before. A massive convoy was approaching from 3 different directions simultaneously, attempting to surround the entire mountain region.
Elena climbed to her highest observation post and studied the approaching forces through her scope. What she saw made her blood run cold.
This wasn't just a military operation, it was preparation for total war. The convoy included artillery pieces, air support, and enough troops to occupy the entire region permanently.
Standing on the peak where she had made her promise weeks earlier, Elena realized that the moment of final decision had arrived. She could disappear into the deep mountains with her father and a few others, abandoning San Rafael but preserving their lives.
Or she could stay and fight an impossible battle against overwhelming odds. As she watched the sun set behind the approaching storm of military vehicles, Elena made her choice. Tomorrow would bring the real test of everything she had learned, everything she had prepared for, and everything she believed about the power of one determined person fighting for their home. The enemy was finally coming in force,
and they were about to discover that the mountains held more secrets than they had ever imagined. The siege began at dawn.
Elena watched from her highest vantage point as 3 separate columns converged on the valley that held San Rafael. Each column brought enough firepower to level a small city, and they moved with the coordination of a military machine that had learned to take mountain resistance seriously.
The southern column approached up the main road with 2 tanks and armored personnel carriers. The eastern group came through the mining trails with heavy artillery. Most concerning of all, the western force included helicopters that could reach places no ground vehicle ever could. Elena's communication network crackled with reports from spotters positioned throughout the region. Eagle 2 reporting tank column approaching checkpoint 7. Mountain Fox sees helicopters, 3 of them, maybe 4. Rabbit's Ear confirms artillery setting up in the eastern valley. For the first time since beginning her campaign, Elena felt the weight of truly impossible odds. She had always known this moment would come, when her psychological warfare would prove insufficient, and the military would bring enough force to crush any resistance through sheer overwhelming power. But she had also spent months preparing for exactly this scenario.
"Father," she said into her radio, knowing Miguel was listening from the village below. "Begin the evacuation protocol. Everyone to the deep caves, just like we practiced." The response came immediately. "Already started, mija. We'll be clear in 30 minutes.
Elena smiled grimly. Whatever happened next, at least the civilians would be safe in the network of caves that stretched deep into the mountain's heart, places so remote and difficult to reach that even experienced climbers rarely found them.
The military strategy became clear. As the morning progressed, rather than attempting to assault the village directly, they were establishing a siege perimeter that would cut off all access routes. They intended to starve out any resistance, then systematically search every cave and hiding place until they found their elusive enemy.
It was a sound plan, the kind that would work against any conventional opponent. But Elena had spent her entire life thinking of these mountains not as obstacles to overcome, but as a living system to work within.
The helicopters made their move first, attempting to establish observation posts on the high peaks that would give them commanding views of the entire region.
Elena had expected this, and she was ready.
Her first shot came from a position the pilots never saw coming. At nearly 1,000 yards, firing upward at a moving target, it should have been an impossible shot.
But Elena had been practicing shots like this for months, understanding that helicopters would be the greatest threat to her campaign. The bullet struck the lead helicopter's tail rotor, sending it spinning out of control.
The pilot managed an emergency landing in a small clearing, but the aircraft was completely disabled. More importantly, the psychological effect on the other pilots was immediate.
If their enemy could hit a moving helicopter at long range with a single shot, nowhere was safe. The remaining helicopters pulled back to safer distances, but this limited their effectiveness as observation platforms. Elena had bought herself time, but she knew it wouldn't last long. The ground assault began in the afternoon. 2 companies of infantry, supported by the tanks, began a methodical advance up the mountain roads. They moved slowly and carefully, checking every possible ambush position, covering each other with overlapping fields of fire. Elena let them come. She had spent weeks preparing what she privately called the gauntlet, a series of positions that would allow her to engage the advancing troops while always maintaining escape routes to the next position. Each site had been chosen for maximum psychological impact rather than tactical advantage. Her first engagement came when the lead company reached the hairpin turn where she had disabled the truck weeks earlier. This time, instead of targeting vehicles, Elena aimed for equipment. Her first shot destroyed a radio on a soldier's back. Her second took out the scope on an officer's rifle. Her third shattered a helmet, stunning but not injuring the man wearing it. The effect was exactly what she intended. The soldiers dove for cover, but there was nowhere to hide on the exposed road. They couldn't see where the shots were coming from, couldn't return effective fire, and couldn't advance without exposing themselves to an enemy who had demonstrated the ability to hit whatever she aimed at. But Elena didn't stay to press her advantage. By the time the soldiers organized a response, she was already moving to her next position, using paths that would have been invisible to anyone not raised in these mountains. Over the following hours, Elena conducted a running battle unlike anything the military had encountered. She would appear long enough to take 2 or 3 precise shots, then vanish before any response could be organized. Sometimes her shots were aimed at equipment. Sometimes they landed close enough to soldiers to remind them how vulnerable they were. Always, she avoided inflicting casualties while making it clear that she could have killed anyone she chose. The psychological warfare was devastating. Soldiers who had been trained to advance aggressively found themselves moving in a crawl, constantly looking over their shoulders, jumping at every sound. Officers struggled to maintain discipline among troops who felt hunted by an enemy they could neither see nor fight. As evening approached, Elena made what everyone later agreed was the most audacious move of the entire campaign. Instead of continuing to fall back, she circled around the advancing troops and began targeting their supply lines. The first indication of this new strategy came when a supply truck attempting to bring ammunition to the advancing troops suffered a spectacular tire blowout that sent it careening into a ditch. Then a fuel tanker discovered that its main valve had been shot out, leaving diesel fuel streaming across the road. Elena was no longer just harassing the attack force. She was cutting off their ability to sustain the operation. The military commanders faced a dilemma they had never anticipated. Their overwhelming advantage in firepower was useless against an enemy they couldn't locate. Their superior numbers meant nothing when their opponent could strike anywhere along a 50-mile front. Their advanced equipment was being systematically disabled by someone who seemed to move through the mountains like a ghost.
As night fell, Elena returned to the village to find it transformed.
Every civilian had evacuated successfully, but Roberto and 3 other volunteers had remained behind to help with the defense. They had spent the day preparing surprises for any soldiers who might attempt a night assault on the empty village. "How many soldiers did you see?" Roberto asked as Elena cleaned her rifle and checked her ammunition. "Nearly 200, spread across 3 approach routes, plus support personnel, vehicle crews, and the helicopter teams." Roberto shook his head in amazement. 200 soldiers, and you've got them afraid to move after dark." Elena allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, but she knew the situation remained precarious. They'll reorganize overnight. Tomorrow they'll try something different. She was right. Dawn brought a new strategy from the military commanders. Instead of continuing their direct assault, they began systematically destroying infrastructure. Artillery shells rained down on the village school, the clinic, and the church. Anything that represented the community Elena was fighting to protect was being reduced to rubble. The message was clear: surrender or watch everything you love burn. Elena climbed to her highest observation post and surveyed the destruction below. Smoke rose from the ruins of buildings where she had learned to read, where she had been baptized, where her community had gathered for generations. The sight filled her with a cold fury that burned away any remaining doubts about her mission. Her response came at midday when the artillery crews were preparing for another bombardment. Elena had studied their positions for hours, noting their routines and identifying their weaknesses. Her shot traveled nearly 1,500 yards, threading between 2 ridgelines to strike the artillery piece's elevation mechanism. The gun was permanently disabled, and the crew dove for cover, convinced they were under attack by a much larger force. But Elena wasn't finished.
Over the following hour, she systematically disabled 2 more artillery pieces and damaged a command vehicle, always staying mobile, always remaining invisible. By afternoon, the military commanders were facing a crisis of confidence. Their soldiers were demoralized, their equipment was being picked off piece by piece, and they had made no measurable progress toward their objective.
Worse stories of the mountain ghost were spreading beyond their immediate command, affecting morale throughout the region. The decision to withdraw came that evening, delivered through encrypted radio channels that Elena's team had learned to monitor. The official reason given was tactical reassessment, but everyone understood the truth. A single sniper, fighting on terrain she knew better than anyone alive, had forced an entire military operation to retreat. Elena watched from her perch as the convoys began their withdrawal, moving much faster than they had advanced. Soldiers who had arrived confident of easy victory departed, looking constantly over their shoulders, knowing that invisible eyes were tracking their every movement. But Elena's victory came at a cost she had not anticipated. 3 days after the military withdrawal, Roberto brought devastating news from his contacts outside the region.
"They're not giving up," he said, his face grim with worry. "They're planning something bigger, much bigger." The intelligence he had gathered painted a terrifying picture. Rather than attempting another conventional assault, the military was preparing to seal off the entire mountain region permanently. They would establish checkpoints at every access route, cut off all supplies and communications, and wait for the isolated population to surrender through starvation. Elena realized that her tactical victory had won a strategic defeat. By proving that the mountains could not be conquered by force, she had convinced her enemies to try conquest through siege.
The choice she faced was brutal in its simplicity. She could surrender herself, hoping to save her community from collective punishment.
Or she could disappear into the deep mountains, living as a hunted fugitive, while her people suffered for her resistance. That night, Elena climbed once more to the peak where she had made her original promise. The stars above were the same ones she had wished upon as a child, but everything else in her world had changed forever. Miguel found her there as dawn was breaking, carrying a pack and wearing the expression of a man who had already made his decision.
"The evacuation routes are ready," he said quietly. "We can guide everyone out through the high passes, get them to safety in the lowlands."
Elena looked at her father, understanding what he was offering.
Total abandonment of their homeland, but survival for everyone she loved. And then what? We become refugees in our own country? Live in camps and wait for the war to end? We live, Miguel said simply. Sometimes that's enough. Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun rise over peaks that had sheltered her family for generations. Finally, she made her decision. "No," she said. "This is our mountain. If they want it, they'll have to take it from me personally." What happened next became the stuff of legend. Elena Vasquez, the shepherd's daughter who had become the mountain's most feared protector, vanished into the high peaks with nothing but her rifle and the clothes on her back. The military established their siege perimeters and waited for surrender. What they got instead was 2 years of the most effective guerrilla campaign in the region's history. Supply convoys disappeared without a trace.
Communications equipment failed mysteriously. Soldiers assigned to mountain duty requested transfers so frequently that some units became effectively unmanned.
Elena had become exactly what her grandfather had been, a ghost in the mountains, invisible and untouchable, striking without warning and vanishing without a trace. The siege ended not through military victory, but through political change.
The military government eventually fell to a popular uprising in the capital, and the new civilian leadership immediately began negotiations for peace. Elena emerged from the mountains 3 years after she had disappeared into them, walking down the main street of San Rafael as if she had never left.
She was thinner, weathered by years of living rough, and her eyes held depths that spoke of solitary nights on frozen peaks. The village rebuilt around the woman who had saved it. Though Elena herself rarely spoke about her years in the high country, she returned to her work in environmental science, helping her community adapt to challenges both natural and human. Sometimes visitors to San Rafael would ask about the stories they had heard, about the woman who had single-handedly defied a military occupation. Elena would smile and change the subject, but her neighbors knew the truth. The mountains had tested their daughter and found her worthy. And in return, she had given them a gift more precious than any treasure, the knowledge that home was worth fighting for, no matter what the odds. No matter what the cost. From the mountain's peak she had watched. And when the enemy came, they never saw her coming.